Hey guys, tonight we journey into the dark heart of ancient Germania, where mist clings to towering oak trees and the ground squelches beneath your boots with centuries of fallen leaves. You can almost smell it now, that earthy dampness mixed with wood smoke drifting from distant settlements. The air tastes of iron and approaching storm, and somewhere in the shadows between the trees, you sense eyes watching, calculating, waiting. This is the world where legends are born in blood and betrayal, where a single man's choice will echo through history like thunder across the valley. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 9 CE, and you stand at the edge of civilization itself. Not the marble civilization of Rome with its aqueducts and amphitheaters, but something older, wilder, more dangerous. The Rhine River cuts through the landscape like a silver blade, separating the known world from the untamed forests beyond. On one side, Roman legions march in perfect formation, their armor gleaming, their standards bright with eagles and glory. On the other side, Germania stretches endlessly into shadow, a realm of tribes and secrets that Rome has never truly conquered. You're about to witness one of history's most shocking reversals, a moment when the unstoppable force of Roman expansion meets an immovable object wrapped in bear fur and cunning. But this isn't just a story about armies clashing in muddy fields. It's about identity, about what happens when you're caught between two worlds, speaking two languages, serving two masters, until the day comes when you must choose which one to betray. The man at the center of our tale was born with a name that would become legend, Arminius. But that wasn't the name his mother whispered to him as a child. That wasn't the name carved into his heart by the forests of his birth. No, that was the name Rome gave him, the name that marked him as theirs, polished and shaped like a weapon they thought they could control. His real name was Hermann, though even that feels too simple for what he would become. Hermann, son of Segamer, prince of the Cherushi, a Germanic tribe that dwelt in the misty valleys where the Weser River wound through ancient woods. Imagine growing up in a world where your greatest heroes were measured not by the gold in their coffers or the marble in their halls, but by the scars on their arms and the loyalty of their warriors. But Hermann's story begins with an ending, or what should have been one. When he was barely more than a boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, Roman diplomacy came knocking at his father's door. Diplomacy in this case meant a simple choice. Give us your sons as hostages, or we'll take them anyway, along with everything else you hold dear. This was Rome's way with the Germanic tribes along the frontier. They called it fostering alliances, building bridges between civilizations. What it really meant was insurance, human collateral to ensure good behavior. Take the chieftain's sons, raise them in Roman schools, teach them Latin and law, and the proper way to march in formation. Turn them into Romans, and when they return to lead their people, they'll remember who fed them, who educated them, who gave them power. It was a clever system, and it usually worked. Usually. Young Hermann was torn from everything he knew and dragged south across the Rhine into a world that must have seemed like stepping into a fever dream. Picture it through the eyes of a Germanic boy who had never seen buildings taller than trees, who had never walked on paved roads or heard water flowing through pipes and walls. Rome, in the time of Augustus, was the greatest city the world had ever known, home to over 1 million souls, a maze of marble and ambition where power was measured in legions and wealth flowed like wine. They gave him a new name, Arminius, derived from the same root as his tribal name, but made Roman, civilized, acceptable to ears accustomed to Latin poetry. They dressed him in a toga instead of furs, taught him to eat while reclining instead of standing, showed him how to speak without the guttural sounds of his native tongue. They were reshaping him, molecule by molecule, into something they could use. And for a time, it seemed to work perfectly. Arminius excelled in his studies, mastering Latin with the same intensity he had once brought to learning the forest paths of his homeland. He studied rhetoric and philosophy, mathematics and engineering. He learned how Roman armies moved, how they fought, how they thought. He learned their strengths and, more importantly, their weaknesses. The Romans were proud of their success. Here was proof that even the wildest barbarian could be civilized, that Germanic ferocity could be channeled into Roman discipline. They pointed to Arminius as evidence of their cultural superiority, never suspecting that they were creating their own nemesis with every lesson they taught him. As he grew older, Arminius was granted Roman citizenship, an honor that meant he could serve in the auxiliary forces that supported the legions. This wasn't charity, it was investment. Rome needed men who could speak both languages, who could move between worlds, who could serve as bridges between the empire and the unconquered tribes beyond the frontier. But here's where the story becomes fascinating, because somewhere in those years of Roman education, something unexpected happened. Instead of forgetting his origins, Arminius seemed to remember them more clearly. Instead of abandoning his Germanic identity, he began to understand it in new ways. Perhaps it was the very completeness of his Roman education that opened his eyes to what his people had lost, or what they were in danger of losing. You see, Rome didn't just conquer territory. It conquered minds, languages, gods, entire ways of life. It took proud Celtic druids and turned them into Roman priests. It took Egyptian pharaohs and made them Roman governors. It was brilliant at absorption, at making conquest feel like partnership, at convincing the conquered that they were better off as Romans than they had ever been as themselves. And for many, this was probably true. Roman citizenship brought privileges, opportunities, access to the greatest civilization on earth. But it also brought obligations, taxes, the requirement to worship Roman gods alongside your own, the slow erosion of everything that made you distinct from the millions of other souls in the empire. Arminius saw this process happening not just to himself, but to his entire people. He watched as Germanic chieftains learned to speak Latin, as they adopted Roman customs, as they sent their own sons south to be educated. He saw the future that Rome had planned for Germania, a future where the ancient forests would be cleared for farms, where tribal councils would be replaced by Roman courts, where the old gods would fade into memory. And somewhere in his heart, something rebelled. But rebellion wasn't simple for a man in his position. By the time he reached adulthood, Arminius wasn't just any Germanic hostage turned Roman citizen. He had become an officer in the auxiliary cavalry trusted with command, respected by his superiors, positioned to rise high in the imperial service. He had wealth, status, a future bright with possibility. All he had to do was continue being the perfect example of successful Roman integration. Instead, he began to plan treason. The opportunity came when he was assigned to serve under Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman governor of Germania. Varus was a man with a reputation, though not necessarily a good one. He had previously governed Syria, where his harsh taxation policies had contributed to unrest. He was known for his arrogance, his assumption that Roman methods could be applied anywhere, to anyone, with the same results. Augustus had chosen Varus specifically to complete the conquest of Germania, to transform it from a collection of fractious tribes into a proper Roman province. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Use Roman roads to connect Germanic settlements, Roman law to replace tribal customs, Roman taxes to fund the province's integration into the empire. It had worked everywhere else. Why not here? Varus arrived in Germania with 3 full legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with auxiliary forces that brought his total command to somewhere between 20 and 25,000 men. These weren't green recruits or barbarian mercenaries. These were professional soldiers, veterans of campaigns across the empire, men who had conquered Gaul and Egypt and Britannia. They represented the finest military machine the ancient world had ever produced. But Varus made a crucial mistake. He trusted Arminius. Why wouldn't he? Arminius spoke perfect Latin, understood Roman military doctrine, had served faithfully in the auxiliary forces. He was exactly the kind of local ally that Roman governors relied on, a bridge between the empire and the tribes, a man who could translate not just languages, but intentions. Arminius played the role perfectly. He provided intelligence about tribal movements, advised on local customs, helped navigate the complex web of alliances and feuds that characterized Germanic politics. He was helpful, reliable, indispensable, and all the while, he was planning the destruction of everything Varus represented. The genius of Arminius lay not just in his deception, but in his understanding of both sides. He knew how Romans thought, how they fought, what they expected. But he also understood something that Varus never grasped about the Germanic tribes. They weren't just a collection of savage warriors waiting to be civilized. They were a people with their own sophisticated political structures, their own military traditions, their own fierce pride in their independence. More importantly, they could be united if the right man knew how to speak to them in the right way at the right moment. And Arminius was becoming that man. In secret meetings in forest clearings, in whispered conversations beside tribal fires, he began weaving a conspiracy that would stretch across dozens of tribes and thousands of warriors. He spoke to them not as a Roman officer, but as Hermann, son of Segamer, a prince of the Cherusci who had seen the future that Rome planned for their children and found it wanting. The message was simple but powerful. Rome would never stop. It would take their lands, their customs, their gods, their very identities, piece by piece, generation by generation, until nothing remained of the free Germanic peoples but names in Roman history books. They could resist now while they still had the strength and will to fight, or they could surrender slowly and let their children grow up as Romans who happened to have Germanic blood. But resistance meant more than just saying no to Roman demands. It meant war, real war, against the greatest military power on earth. And war meant that many of them would die. Their halls would burn, their families would suffer. This wasn't a decision to make lightly or in anger. It required careful planning, perfect timing, and leadership that could hold the alliance together when the killing started. Arminius provided that leadership, but he also provided something else: knowledge. He knew how Roman armies moved, how they made camp, how they reacted to ambush. He knew their signals, their formations, their weaknesses. He had spent years learning to think like a Roman officer, and now he would use that knowledge to destroy Roman power in Germania forever. The trap he planned was masterful in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. But that trap and the battle that would follow deserves its own telling, its own moment in the firelight of memory. The web Arminius began to weave stretched across Germania like frost on autumn leaves, delicate but deadly, connecting tribes that had feuded for generations. You have to understand, uniting Germanic tribes was like trying to herd wolves. Each clan, each chieftain, each warrior band had its own grievances, its own ambitions, its own reasons to distrust their neighbors. The Cherushi might ally with the Bructeri against a common enemy, but they'd been raiding each other's cattle for decades. The Chauci controlled the coastal regions and looked down on the inland tribes as backwards. The Chatti were fierce fighters, but suspicious of everyone. Yet, somehow, through patience and cunning that would have impressed Odysseus himself, Arminius began to forge them into something resembling unity. Not love, not friendship, but shared purpose. He spoke to each tribe in the language they understood best. To the Chatti, he emphasized honor and the shame of bowing to foreign masters. To the Bructeri, he talked about the practical benefits of controlling their own trade routes rather than paying Roman taxes. To the coastal tribes, he painted pictures of Roman fleets turning their harbors into military bases. But it was more than words. Arminius understood that trust had to be earned in blood and oath in the ancient ways his people respected. He participated in their rituals, drank from their ceremonial horns, swore oaths by their gods. When tribal disputes arose, he mediated them with the wisdom of someone who had seen how the wider world worked, but hadn't forgotten the old customs. He was becoming something new, something that hadn't existed before in Germania, a leader who could speak to all the tribes as one of their own, yet with the authority of someone who had walked in the halls of power. The Romans, meanwhile, saw none of this. To Varus and his officers, the Germanic tribes were exactly what they appeared to be on the surface: fractious barbarians who spent more time fighting each other than building anything lasting. The idea that these people could coordinate a conspiracy spanning hundreds of miles of forest was simply beyond Roman comprehension. They had conquered Gaul by exploiting exactly these kinds of tribal divisions. Why should Germania be any different? This blindness was Rome's greatest weakness, though they never recognized it as such. The empire was so successful, so accustomed to victory, that it had developed a kind of cultural arrogance that made certain possibilities invisible. Romans didn't just believe they were superior to barbarians. They knew it, the way you know the sun rises in the east. It was a fact as fundamental as gravity. So when Arminius came to Varus with reports of tribal unrest in the remote forests, when he suggested that a show of Roman force might be needed to prevent larger problems, Varus listened with the patience of a teacher dealing with a promising but still somewhat primitive student. Of course, there was tribal unrest. There was always tribal unrest among barbarians. The solution was always the same. March out with sufficient force to overawe the troublemakers, make examples of the ringleaders, remind everyone why Roman rule was preferable to chaos. The plan Arminius presented was perfectly reasonable by Roman standards. A quick march into the interior, a demonstration of Roman power, some arrests and executions to restore order, then back to winter quarters before the weather turned truly foul. It was exactly the kind of operation Roman armies had been conducting successfully for centuries across the length and breadth of the empire. Except this time, the barbarians were expecting them. Picture the scene as Varus prepared his expedition. 3 full legions, the pride of the Roman army, checking their equipment with the mechanical precision of soldiers who had done this countless times before. Each legion was a self-contained military machine, roughly 5,000 men organized into centuries and cohorts, supported by engineers, medical staff, and all the specialists needed to keep an army functioning in hostile territory. The 17th Legion, commanded by Marcus Aeus, had served with distinction in Pannonia and Dalmatia. The 18th, under Sionius, had fought in the Alpine campaigns. The 19th, led by Lucius Aegius, had seen action in Germania before and knew the territory. These weren't parade ground soldiers or garrison troops grown soft from easy living. These were veterans, men who had faced Germanic warriors in battle and won. Their equipment was the finest the ancient world could produce. Each legionnaire carried a gladius, that short stabbing sword that had conquered half the known world, along with a shield, 2 javelins, and enough personal kit to sustain him on a march of weeks. Their armor was segmented steel that could turn aside most weapons. Their training was so thorough that they could build a fortified camp, fight a battle, and break camp again with machine-like efficiency. Supporting them were auxiliary units drawn from across the empire, Germanic cavalry, ironically enough, men from tribes that had already submitted to Roman rule and now served the eagle standards they had once fought against. Gallic infantry, Syrian archers, specialists in siege warfare and engineering. In total, somewhere between 20 and 25,000 men, a force large enough to conquer kingdoms. But armies don't move in straight lines through trackless forests, and they don't fight on parade grounds where formations stay neat and signals carry clearly. Arminius knew this better than anyone, because he had studied not just Roman tactics, but Roman logistics. He understood that The greater an army's strength, the greater its vulnerability when that strength couldn't be properly deployed. The route he suggested to Varus was tactically sound by Roman standards. It followed known paths through the forest, connected tribal settlements that needed to see Roman power, and would allow the legions to return to their base before winter made campaigning impossible. What the route also did, though Varus never realized it, was channel the Roman army through terrain that Arminius and his allies had been preparing for months. Every mile of that march had been scouted, measured, planned. Where the path narrowed between bog and hillside, where bridges crossed streams, where the forest pressed closest to the road, where visibility was poorest and communication most difficult. The Germanic warriors knew every tree, every rock, every muddy depression where a man might stumble or a horse might lose its footing. More importantly, they had been practicing. This wasn't going to be a wild charge of howling barbarians hoping to overwhelm Roman discipline through sheer ferocity. Arminius had seen enough Roman battles to know that approach led to slaughter. Instead, this would be something new, something that combined Germanic knowledge of the terrain with tactical innovations borrowed from Roman military science and adapted to forest warfare. The warriors were organized not into the traditional war bands that followed individual chieftains, but into coordinated units that could strike specific targets and then melt back into the woods. They had practiced moving silently through undergrowth, communicating with horn calls that sounded like bird cries, coordinating attacks across miles of forest using signals that Romans would never recognize as military communications. They had also prepared the battlefield itself. Fallen trees had been left across certain paths to force the Romans into predetermined routes. Stream crossings had been weakened so they would collapse under the weight of heavy equipment. Supply caches had been hidden at strategic points so the Germanic forces could sustain a prolonged engagement without having to retreat for food and weapons. Perhaps most importantly, they had prepared themselves mentally for what was coming. This wasn't just another raid or tribal conflict. This was a war of annihilation, a deliberate power in Germania's sought attempt to destroy Rome completely, that it would be generations before the eagles dared venture across the Rhine again. Every warrior who joined the conspiracy understood that they were risking not just their own lives, but the future of their people. The genius of Arminius lay in his ability to make this massive undertaking feel not like a desperate gamble, but like an inevitable victory. He had seen Roman armies defeated before in small skirmishes and ambushes along the frontier. He knew they could bleed, could be confused, could make mistakes. What he proposed was simply taking those lessons and applying them on a scale never before attempted. But there was another element to his planning that was purely Germanic, something no Roman education could have taught him. He understood the power of story, of myth, of the tales warriors tell themselves to find courage in dark moments. The conspiracy he built wasn't just military. It was spiritual, psychological, cultural. He reminded his of ancient allies' victories, of times when their ancestors had driven back invaders and preserved their freedom. He spoke of the old gods, of Wotan and Donar, of divine favor for those who fought to protect their homeland. He wove together practical military planning with the kind of deep cultural narrative that could sustain men through the horror of battle. Because, make no mistake, what Arminius was planning would be horrific beyond anything most of his warriors had ever experienced. Roman legions didn't just fight. They butchered with systematic efficiency anyone who opposed them. The Germanic warriors knew this, had seen the aftermath of Roman victories in other tribal territories. Whole villages burned, populations enslaved, chieftains crucified as examples. Yet somehow, Arminius convinced them that this time would be different. This time, they would be the ones doing the butchering. This time, it would be Roman mothers weeping for sons who would never return home. Roman wives waiting for husbands whose bones would bleach in Germanic forests. The psychological preparation was as important as the military planning, because what Arminius was asking his people to do was not just fight Romans, but to overcome generations of conditioning that told them Romans were invincible. Ever since the first Germanic tribes had encountered Roman armies, the lesson had been consistent. Romans might lose individual battles, but they always won wars. They had more men, better equipment, superior organization, inexhaustible resources. Arminius had to convince his allies that all of that could be overcome by fighting smarter rather than harder, by using the forest itself as a weapon, by turning Roman strengths into weaknesses. It was a hard sell, requiring not just military credibility, but something approaching religious authority. And somehow, incredibly, he managed it. By the summer of 9 CE, the conspiracy was ready. Thousands of warriors from dozens of tribes had committed themselves to the plan. Weapons had been hidden, routes planned, signals established. The greatest ambush in military history was prepared and waiting. All that remained was for Varus to take the bait. The morning Varus received the urgent message, autumn mist clung to the Roman camp like a burial shroud. You can picture the scene. Leather tent flaps heavy with dew, braziers smoking in the pre-dawn darkness, the sound of 20,000 men stirring to another day of garrison duty. The message came from one of Arminius's trusted scouts, breathless and mud splattered from a hard ride through the night. "Rebellion," he gasped. The Angrivari tribe had risen against Roman tax collectors. Villages burned, Roman citizens murdered, the uprising spreading like wildfire through the remote valleys beyond the Weser. Worse yet, other tribes were watching, waiting to see how Rome would respond. Show weakness now, and the entire province might explode into revolt. Varus listened with the weary patience of a man who had dealt with barbarian uprisings before. These people were like children, prone to tantrums when they didn't get their way, but quick to submit when faced with overwhelming force. A show of strength, a few executions perhaps, burning a village or two as an example, and order would be restored. It was a tedious but necessary part of governing barbarians. Arminius stood at his shoulder during the briefing, nodding gravely at the scout's report, offering tactical advice with the authority of someone who knew the local terrain intimately. Yes, the Angrivarii were dangerous when roused. Yes, their strongholds were difficult to assault directly, but there were paths through the forest, routes that would allow the legions to approach undetected. and crush the rebellion before it could spread further. The irony was perfect. Here was Varus planning the destruction of a rebellion that existed only in Arminius's imagination, while the real conspiracy gathered strength all around him like wolves closing on wounded prey. Every Germanic auxiliary in the Roman camp, every tribal chieftain who had sworn loyalty to the eagle standards, every guide and interpreter who helped the legions navigate the forest paths, they were all part of it now. But Varus saw none of this. How could he? In his world, barbarians were incapable of the kind of sophisticated deception Arminius was orchestrating. They might lie about small things, cheat in trade, break oaths when it suited them, but they lacked the intelligence and discipline for grand strategy. The very complexity of the conspiracy made it invisible to Roman eyes. The preparations took 3 days. 3 days of organized chaos as the legions prepared for what they assumed would be a routine, punitive expedition. Weapons were sharpened, supplies loaded, routes planned. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions would march in column, supported by auxiliary cavalry and Germanic guides who knew the forest paths. They would strike hard and fast, crush the rebellion, and return to winter quarters with another victory to add to Rome's endless catalog of triumphs. Arminius used those 3 days to send final messages to his allies scattered across Germania. The horn calls that echoed through the forest sounded like hunting signals to Roman ears, but they carried a different meaning to those who knew how to listen. The eagles are coming. Take your positions. Remember your oaths. Fight for your children's freedom. The morning of departure dawned gray and cold, with the kind of penetrating dampness that soaks through wool and leather to chill the bones. You can feel it even now, that bone-deep cold that makes armor feel like ice against the skin, that turns every breath into a visible ghost in the air. The legions formed up with mechanical precision, each man in his assigned place, each century ready to move at the centurion's command. But something was different this time. The Germanic auxiliaries seemed tense, their horses skittish, their eyes scanning the tree line with an alertness that went beyond normal caution. A few Roman officers noticed, made jokes about barbarian superstitions, laughed at the way these forest dwellers jumped at shadows. They had no idea they were looking at men who knew they were marching toward the greatest battle of their lives. The column that left the Roman camp that morning stretched for miles through the forest. 25,000 men, their equipment, their supply wagons, their camp followers, all strung out along paths barely wide enough for a single cart. At the head rode Varus himself, confident in his mission, surrounded by his staff officers and Germanic guides who smiled and pointed out landmarks with the helpful enthusiasm of men eager to please their Roman masters. Arminius rode with them, playing his role to perfection. He discussed the weather, the condition of the paths, the best places to camp for the night. He was the ideal subordinate, knowledgeable but deferential, ready with advice when asked, but never presumptuous enough to offer it unsolicited. Every word, every gesture, every expression was calculated to reinforce Varus's confidence in his loyalty. Behind them, the legions marched with a steady rhythm that had carried Roman arms to the edges of the known world. Left, right, left, right. The sound of hobnailed boots striking earth in perfect unison, a sound that had terrified barbarians from Britain to Mesopotamia. The standards gleamed even in the gray light, bronze eagles and silver medallions that represented centuries of victory, thousands of battles won, millions of enemies defeated. But this forest was different from the battlefields where those victories had been won. Here, the trees pressed close on either side, their branches interlocking overhead to block out most of the sky. Here, the paths twisted and turned through landscape that seemed designed by malevolent gods to confuse and disorient strangers. Here, every shadow might hide an enemy. Every sound might signal an attack. The Germanic guides led them deeper into this maze with the confidence of men who had walked these paths since childhood. They knew where the ground was firmest, where streams could be forded safely, where the forest opened into clearings large enough for the legions to deploy. They were invaluable, irreplaceable, absolutely essential for the success of the mission. They were also leading the Romans directly into the jaws of the largest military trap ever conceived in the forests of Germania. The first day's march passed without incident, though several officers commented on the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. It was too quiet, they said. Where were the birds? Where were the sounds of normal forest life? Even the Germanic guide seemed subdued, speaking in whispers, glancing nervously at the shadows between the trees. Arminius explained it easily enough. The tribes knew Roman armies were moving through their territory. They had driven their livestock deeper into the forest, hidden their families in remote valleys, abandoned their usual hunting grounds to avoid contact with the legions. It was normal barbarian behavior, the kind of prudent cowardice you'd expect from people who understood they couldn't stand against Roman military might. That night, they made camp in a clearing that seemed almost purpose-built for a Roman fortified position. The guides had chosen well, Varus thought. High ground, clear fields of fire, access to water, defensible on all sides. His engineers worked with their usual efficiency, digging ditches, raising ramparts, establishing the kind of temporary fortress that allowed Roman armies to sleep safely in enemy territory. But even as the legions settled into their routine of guard duty and camp maintenance, unseen eyes watched from the darkness beyond the firelight. Thousands of Germanic warriors lay hidden in the forest, so close they could smell the smoke from Roman cooking fires, so patient they barely breathed as sentries passed within spear's throw of their hiding places. The second day brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the forest paths into rivers of mud and made every step treacherous. The column stretched even further as men struggled to keep their footing on slippery ground, as wagons bogged down in ruts that seemed to appear from nowhere, as horses slipped and stumbled under loads that had seemed manageable the day before. This, too, was part of Arminius's plan. He had chosen the timing of the expedition carefully, waiting for the season when autumn rains would turn the forest into an ally for his warriors and an enemy for the Roman legions. Every muddy footstep made the Romans more vulnerable, more dependent on their Germanic guides, more committed to following paths that led inexorably toward destruction. The guides themselves began to show signs of nervousness that even Roman officers couldn't ignore. They muttered among themselves in their barbarous tongue, made signs against evil, consulted omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of falling leaves. When questioned, they spoke of bad spirits in this part of the forest, of ancient battles that had left the ground cursed, of tribal taboos that made them reluctant to proceed. But proceed they did, because Arminius was there to reassure Varus that these were merely barbarian superstitions, the kind of primitive fears that civilized men could safely ignore. The mission was too important to be derailed by ghost stories. Roman discipline would protect them from whatever imaginary dangers lurked in barbarian minds. On the morning of the third day, as the column prepared to resume its march through increasingly hostile terrain, Arminius made his final preparations for treachery. He sent his last messages to the tribal war leaders, confirmed that all units were in position, reviewed the signals that would coordinate the attack across miles of forest. Everything was ready. The trap that had taken months to prepare was about to spring shut on the finest army in the ancient world. But as the legions formed up for what they assumed would be another routine day of marching toward a routine victory, none of them suspected that they were about to walk into the greatest military disaster in Roman history. None of them knew that the helpful Germanic guides who had led them this far were about to reveal their true loyalties. None of them understood that every step forward was a step deeper into carefully prepared killing ground. The forest waited in silence, holding its breath for the moment when 25,000 Roman soldiers would learn the price of trusting a barbarian who had never forgotten that his real name was Hermann. The moment came with deceptive quietness, like the pause between lightning and thunder. You're following the Roman column as it winds deep into the forest, watching 25,000 men march unknowingly toward their fate. The path has narrowed again, forcing the legions to stretch even thinner, their formation becoming a serpent of steel and leather, threading through trees that seem to lean inward with malevolent intent. Arminius rides near the front, his face a mask of concerned helpfulness as he points out landmarks to Varus. But his eyes are different now, if you know how to look. They're the eyes of a predator watching prey stumble into position. Every gesture, every word is calculated, rehearsed, perfect. He's been preparing for this moment his entire adult life. And now, it's finally here. The Germanic guides begin to act strangely, their nervousness becoming more pronounced with each passing hour. They whisper among themselves, make excuses to ride ahead or fall behind, their movements becoming increasingly erratic. A few Roman officers notice, but Arminius is quick with explanations. Tribal superstitions, he says, fear of ancient battlegrounds, the usual barbarian foolishness. But you can see what the Romans cannot. The guides aren't nervous. They're getting into position. Each man who rides ahead is carrying final messages to warriors hidden in the forest. Each delay, each excuse to check the path or water the horses is another opportunity to confirm that everything is ready. The web is complete, the trap is set, and the prey is exactly where it needs to be. The forest itself seems to be holding its breath. The usual sounds of woodland life have faded to nothing, leaving only the squelch of boots in mud the creak of leather, the jangle of equipment. Even the rain has stopped. The water still drips steadily from branches overhead, each drop hitting armor or cloak with a sound like tiny drums counting down to doom. Then Arminius makes his move, and it's so simple, so perfectly ordinary, that none of the Romans suspect anything until it's far too late. He approaches Varus with the same respectful manner he's maintained throughout the expedition, the same helpful tone that has earned him the Roman commander's complete trust. There's been a development, he reports. His scouts have discovered the exact location of the rebel stronghold. It's closer than they thought, hidden in a valley just beyond the next ridge. But the path is treacherous, barely wide enough for men on foot. The column will need to divide, send the cavalry and light infantry ahead, while the legions follow more slowly with the heavy equipment. And so the forest closes around them, those doomed legions marching deeper into shadow with every step. In a few hours, the Teutoburg forest will echo with screams and the clash of steel. 25,000 Roman soldiers learning too late that their trusted guide was always their greatest enemy. Arminius, who became Hermann again in the moment of truth, would give Rome a wound that never fully healed, proving that even empires have limits, and that sometimes the student surpasses the master in ways no one expects. The mist still clings to those ancient trees, and if you listen closely on quiet nights, you might still hear the whispers of a man who chose his people over his empire and changed the course of history with that choice.